So back in 2018 I just finished my donut tutorial and moved on to my next project. I was trying to make this image here, but I ended up making this. Now I want to try remaking this scene, applying everything that I've learnt since the original. Hopefully you'll see how all the small things you learn over time add up and you'll eventually be making renders unrecognisable from your old ones. Before we do anything in Blender we need to choose some assets. I'm going to use ambient CG as it's all high quality and copyright free textures. Just going to get some Christmas ornament textures going on in this wicker texture to put them on. Now let's look at making our assets with those textures. First thing I'm going to do is make a candy cane using this texture. To make this I'm going to use a basic curve with 3 handles to make a hook. And there's no way I could have done this originally, I don't even think I knew what a curve was. Then I just used the round bevel in the curve menu to give it some thickness. Converted it to a mesh and gave it a quick UV map. Set up the texture and scaled the UVs to match it. And then I just plugged in the bump and the roughness maps to give it a little bit more detail in the shader. Did the same thing with the baubles, scaled the UVs to match the texture, and just plugged in all the maps that it gave me. Then for the tops I just used this ref to figure out the shape, and just used some basic modelling techniques to make this little top. Gave it a gold material. And I would have stopped here originally, but I wanted to bring the detail in the scene up a little bit, so I plugged in this Voronoi texture into the bump, just to give it a little bit of a beaten up metal look. And you can already see the difference this makes just from working on the shaders here, where everything was perfectly smooth in the original. Now I was starting to look at a rough composition, so I just added in a camera, placed my assets on a plane. But at this point nothing was modelled to scale, so I just scaled everything down until the dimensions of the bauble made more sense. In my original render this wasn't something that I thought was a problem, but working at a real scale makes a big difference to lighting and depth of field settings. So you can see in the original where the scale was way too big, it didn't match at all the kind of depth of field you would expect from this kind of macro photography and in the reference. So always use real scale in your renders. Now it was time to start looking at the material on this floor plane, so I just brought in all the maps and focused on the base colour first to get the scale right. And then I gave it a bunch of subdivisions to give it some micro displacement. Also gave it a subdivision modifier as well, just to make sure I had enough geometry there. And then just plug the displacement map into this displacement node. And then nothing happens by default. So in the material properties, you just have to turn displacement to displacement and bump or displacement only. And now the scale's just way too big by default, but if you turn it way down, you can see the actual geometry moves to match the texture, which brings a whole nother level of detail to the scene. But you can see in my original, I did use a floor texture, but it was just a really low res rug texture, and there was no other maps with it, it just ended up looking like a stuck on JPEG. I then also made another variation of the bauble to add some interest to the scene, made this one silver, and just gave it another texture. And to add more detail to the scene, I used some curved circles to make these little strings attached to the baubles. And even though these are very, very faint, I think they help add something to the scene. Also just added one more variation to the scene, which is just a plain bauble. That way when it came to dressing, I'd have 3 options, the 2 patterns and this plain one, plus colour variations as well. The big difference in how I set up this plain bauble versus my original though is using roughness maps instead of just dialing up the roughness value there, and this adds so much detail in terms of scratches and fingerprints, and because nothing in the real world is perfectly uniform, I think this helps bring that realism up a lot. Just using a colour ramp to dial in the roughness of that as well. So at this point I felt ready to start dressing the scene with these assets, but first I wanted to find a nice HDR. Because these assets are basically pure reflection, it helps me dress when I know how they will look in render a little bit more. So I tried out a couple of HDRs, but ended up settling on a Christmas theme one which made sense for the scene, and also allowed me to line up a Christmas tree in the background without having to model anything. One thing you always see in Christmas photography is a shaped bokeh in the background, and this is really easy to achieve in Blender. You just have to, under your depth of field settings on the camera, just turn up the blades to control the number of sides on that shape. But here I actually ended up undoing that, setting the blades to 0 and then the ratio to 2 to get these sort of elliptical shapes in the background. And from there, I was just trying to refine my composition basically. So just playing around with where the assets are positioned, all in rendered view, really helps me a lot. And also refining the camera position too. Playing with the colors of the baubles. I also brought in a secondary plane just for the background. And this one didn't have any of that micro displacement on it, so it was much more performant, but it helped me extend the scene a bit more. Then I just brought in a couple more assets from Polyhaven, this little elephant and a table, just to help fill the scene out a bit more, give it a lot more depth than my original. Sometimes I like to turn depth of field off while I'm working to get a better sense of how the scene's actually looking, then turn it back on, it usually looks better. But yeah, I found a lower camera angle helped with the composition of the scene a lot, but this is more like photography principles at this point, but kept playing with the colours of these and the roughness and how I wanted them positioned throughout the scene. And I've obviously sped this up a lot, but you can see how long it takes me to sort of find a composition that I like. And, you know, don't be afraid to spend a lot of time on this stage. It's really one of the most important in my opinion. Once I got to this stage, I knew I pretty much had my composition and lighting nearly done, so I started looking at compositing. And I actually used the viewport compositor in Blender, and this is just like a real-time compositor. It didn't exist when I did my original, but it's really nice for this kind of stuff. So I pretty much had what I wanted in the viewport, so I didn't have to add too many nodes. I just added a bit of lens distortion and this vignette around the edges, and a couple glows as well. But then I noticed my scene was getting quite dark, so I added in this plane to bounce light back into the scene in the foreground, and this really helped brighten the scene up and make it feel like things were happening off camera. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So here's a before and an after. Now the point here is that it takes a lot of time to progress both creatively and technically in Blender. If I had access to Blender 4.0 for my original render, it would have still probably looked the same, just because I didn't have the art fundamentals nailed. So it really is a good idea to try and learn some of those fundamentals before you get too bogged down in the technical aspects.